It's working.
欢迎你们到那个全球道教研究座谈这是一个双语的一种会议的，所以那个下面一个 chat 你可以用中文还是英文写你的问题的，他们就是前面这个1个钟头也可以写你的问题，没问题。1个小时后我们一个 question answer， 你可以就是我可以帮你问问题，还是你可以 unmute 你自己问。可是你用中文的话要说慢一点的，and that goes for English too. So welcome to the Global Taoist Studies Forum. It's a bilingual event, right? So the speakers are speaking in English. I need to take my own advice and speak slower too. So just make sure, especially in the question and answer part of the talk, that not everyone is a native speaker, so just to kind of be aware of that. So we're really excited to have 3 scholars that need no introduction, luminaries in our field. And on Tianshidao, the heavenly masters, celestial masters, something that all of us know has been studied for many years, right? But we have 3 new books on the topic, and I would say revolutionary and bringing new questions to mind. So that's really one of the main purposes today, not only to hear about these new books, but think about questions that can move us forward and bring more research. So I think we'll go in the order of the publication date of the 3 books. So we'll let Terry Kleeman go first. Terry, would you like to take the floor?
A very great Global Taoist Forum group for providing this forum for us. I'm traveling, so I'm a little bit discombobulated, but I hope things come together. One of the things Jonathan suggested as a topic for this talk is how our understanding of the celestial masters, Tianshidao Chuantong, has changed over time. And this got me thinking back to my grad school days. I'm now in the Bay Area, very close to Berkeley, where I was trained by Michel Strickmann, among others, Ed Schaefer, and other good scholars. One of the things that Strickmann taught us, I guess, one of the things that I got from Strickmann that I thought was particularly useful and important was this idea of the celestial masters as a type of revolution, as an overturning of popular religion that had come before this. And all of the gods that had come before were now demons, and only the new class of Taoist deities were actually gods. And this was this tremendous revolution that took over China and started the Taoist tradition. And in this, the 6 heavens then are sources of evil and corruption, something to be battled against, diametrically opposed to the celestial masters. But I always had some doubts about this, and in recent years, this has grown. When you think even about the original celestial masters, beyond the 3 heavens, there is also the 3 officers, the Sanguan. And the Sanguan are in charge of the dead, but they are Taoist deities. And they have staffs underneath them. They have huge hordes of officials and people who work for them. Presumably, those figures are all denizens of the 6 heavens. And yet here they are in a perfectly good Taoist context doing work for Taoist priests and Taoist gods, the Sanguan. So, and I'm sure that at least while they were alive, or perhaps even now, many of these 6 heavens figures that are in the service of the 3 officers received blood sacrifice. Now, whether they did this while they were serving the 6 heavens or not, this is more of a question, I think. But you see that the borders of this are somewhat fluid in any case. When you come to what I think of as the earliest Taoist scripture, the Nuqing Gui Lu. There you see a host of demons and how to control them. You're given their secret names so that you have power over them. But many of these figures are also ambiguous and have a role in the bureaucracy. The figure that really struck me was the 30-foot high demon, San Zhang Gui, who is a regular demon during the day and wreaks havoc on people. And then at night, he goes up to heaven and reports to the heavenly officials. So he's clearly also part of the heavenly bureaucracy in some sense. So my conclusion on this topic is that in fact, the 6 heavens and the 3 heavens need to be in cooperation. That in fact, the 6 heavens as a normal course of things are ruled by the 3 heavens and operate according to their rules. And it is only when you get miscreants and lawbreakers, people who don't follow the rules, that you actually have a problem with the 6 heavens. And we see this stated more clearly in a slightly later text, the Dongyuan Shenzhou Jing, where it's clear that the people who are the source of problem are what they call tuoji gui, demons that have escaped their registers. And as long as they are on their registers and in control, they're no problem. They're part of the forces of heaven. They are, as what the Chinese famously saying, 代天行化, carrying out transformation on behalf of heaven. Now, in spite of this, how am I doing for time? I'm okay, huh? One does have to say that these, the popular realm still had a certain appeal. And Taoists really saw themselves as making a sacrifice by foregoing this. This comes out very clearly in one text I've studied recently, the Tianshidao. This isn't that whole scripture by the name, it's the very first piece in that one before the Da Dao Jialin Jie and Yang Pinzhi and all those texts that we've used so effectively. This text has largely been ignored, it's a little bit later. But what you really see in this text is Tianshidao followers recognizing that they're not getting all of the delicious fruits that the commoners, the profane, get from their worship of deities. Encouraging them, you know, even though you're not being wished through worship of these demons, you're good Taoists, and God and heaven will protect you and whatever. And I thought that was an interesting sort of sidelight on this. So I'm getting a little short on time. Recently, I've been interested in how this relates to this debate about Tao versus Fa. This is a big issue in some places, especially in Taiwan, where I often read scriptures with my friends. Taiwanese scholars tend to assume that Fa Shi in the past were like modern Fa Shi in Taiwan. In other words, they are the official representatives of popular religion, if you will. They are the ones who deal with all of those 6 heavens type guys. To me, that may well be the case now, but it doesn't seem like that was historically what was going on in Taoism. Instead, my understanding of Tao and Fa is that Tao is truth, knowledge, wisdom, supernatural existences, things like that. And Fa is how you use them, how you employ them, how you put them into action somehow. I think you can see this already in the development of celestial master registers. When you get the lower registers, you're clearly just relying on the forces of heaven. You're submitting petitions, and then heaven is sending out troops to deal with things. But when you get into the upper celestial master registers, the ones studied by John Lagerway a few years ago, what you see is that people are more and more taking direct control of these ritual methods. They are exerting direct control over these spirits rather than going through heaven. And to me, that's sort of the essence of one important development in Taoism. And in that regard, you can think of every major new revelation in Taoism as, in a sense, an attempt to increase the power of the celestial master, of the Taoist priest, and increase his direct control over the forces of the universe. A good example of this transition, I think, is this text I talked about a couple of years ago, 无上三天法师说因喻众生妙经. This is a late Tang text, and it's about a revelation that creates a new Fa. The source of the revelation is explicitly Zhang Daoling, so it's clearly, in some sense, celestial master, I suppose. The figure who receives the revelation is a Sandong Fa Shi, so he is at the highest level of Taoism. And this was a time when clearly the term Fa Shi was a title of respect, denoting the highest Taoists, not popular, uneducated, shoeless Taoist shamans or something like that. He does create a new Fa in response to a specific type of problem. There's a major drought going on in his area, and Zhang Daoling reveals this, and the Sandong Fa Shi then spreads it all through the area, and everybody adopts this new Fa. To me, this is a good model for how all of the Fa Shi traditions probably arose. They don't seem to arise from illiterate shamans first, because such people have no status in Chinese society. They are not in any sense prepared to lead a new movement or to gather followers or whatever. There is an interesting question about whether the ultimate origin of some of these new methods might be in popular religion. And in fact, some people have argued that each new revelation is a new response to developments in popular religion, which I think is something that might be worth talking about. We do have some good evidence for this. Recently, I've been reading the Tiantan Yuge with some friends in Taiwan, and that shows you a lot about how Taoism thought of these things. But that is really getting into the area of one of our later speakers, Vincent, who has done considerably more work in this area than I. So I think I will just say that I think those texts are a continuation of the Niqin Guili and are all in the Taoist tradition. Still lots to be studied in that area. So I think that's pretty much what I have to say for today. And I will turn it over to my fellow presenters, Franciscus and Vincent. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Terry. Let me start by repeating my admiration for Terry's work. He's really, for the first time, given us a comprehensive view of all the sources, treated in a rigorous way, dealing with the beginnings of this movement, a fundamental question that has defied comprehensive treatment for more than half a century. So here we have it. Imperiled Destinies covers, in some ways, in some respects, similar ground, but with quite a different approach, I think. I've wanted to describe the development of several ideas that were central to medieval Heavenly Master Taoism, and by tracing their evolution, concepts like spiritual debt, retribution, sacrifice, deliverance, by tracing these concepts in the Heavenly Master tradition through its formative period, I wanted to invite the reader to approach Taoism through a set of paradigms that are fundamental, in fact, to all religions, thus placing Tianshidao in a comparative perspective. From the 2nd through the 10th century, Taoism evolved into China's main liturgical organization. The parallel growth of Buddhism broadened Taoist awareness of the vast universe of Indian soteriology and transformed their thinking about the causes of suffering the nature of evil, and the aims of liberation. A key innovation was the Taoist adoption of the Bodhisattva ideal of compassion and the doctrine of universal salvation. In the 5th century, the Reformation of the Heavenly Master and Lingbao Patriarch, Lu Xiujing, interiorized the quest of deliverance. Medieval Taoist thinking about human bondage and release, preservation and liberation, and the nature of redemptive ritual took a decisive new turn with the reforms of Lu Xiujing. Although he was a seemingly conservative defender of the institutions of the early Heavenly Master community, Lu was in fact a radical innovator who fundamentally transformed medieval Taoism. Breaking with the practice of sacrifice, or more precisely, the ancient imperative of shedding blood for atonement, early Heavenly Master Taoism already retained the language of sacrifice, transforming the nature of the offerings. Formerly intended to provide sustenance to the spirits, the Heavenly Master offering became a contractual pledge that committed the supplicant to adhere to the new ritual and moral code, and conferred also on him reciprocally, or her, rights over the spirit world. This was the cornerstone of the Heavenly Master dispensation. Taoism was, to be sure, not alone among world religions to have made sacrificial reform its foundation. Under the Lingbao reform, the redemptive offering, formerly an outward material sacrifice framed in the ritual setting of a court audience, became interiorized as an act of self-abnegation, a faith pledge, or a vow to observe precepts. Lu Xiujing decisively turned the supplicant's gaze within, with phrases like, "The quest for life starts from the abdomen," or "Destiny resides in one's own person," or "Long life is vested in the self." Salvaging one's destiny was predicated on the construction of a Taoist self, a central preoccupation in both spiritual and intellectual circles in 5th century Jiangnan. Think of the pure conversation, Qingtan, fascination with character appraisal, and the attempt to make the individuating spirit transpire from a person's features, postures, expressions, or reactions. In painting too, it's the eyes where that offer a window into a person's self. This self-centered inner vision allowed an adept not only to know and preserve his or her own person, but to interiorize the wider universe as well. The final destination of the interior journey was a return to one's original nature. This very Taoist view of liberation allowed Lu Xiujing to connect the Jai retreat, despite its unmistakably Buddhist overtones, back to the spiritual universe of Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. The completely integrated liturgical order of the tongue finally encompassed both the petition ritual and the retreat, as well as rituals sponsored by the state, plus the ordained clergy, a growing monastic community, and lay believers. Imperial Destiny approaches the historical complexities of this formative period from a pragmatic point of view, asking simply what concerns motivated medieval Taoists to seek the ritual services of the clergy in the first place, and what answers and solutions Taoist priests had to propose. The typical supplicant in a Taoist ritual sought release from a crisis of misfortune, illness, want, astrological predicament, or post-mortem retribution suffered by family members. The book pays particular attention to the agents of deliverance. Petition rituals were designed to sway the powers of fate. On the stage of redemption, you have several sets of actors facing each other, the ritual sponsor and beneficiaries, the officiating priest or several priests, and the divine arbiters of the fate of the person concerned, the beneficiary. Beneficiaries could be deceased ancestors or distant communities who are not present. Sponsors could be represented by proxies. So I have wanted to focus on the interaction between these living and spiritual agents that interact there, also lay and clergy, to produce a desired result. The objective, in order to be achieved, needed to be formally announced to the gods. Such intentions were generally stated in the form of written prayers. And this choice of medium, I believe, was not accidental. Since the first appearance of Chinese writings, it served to communicate with the spirit world, or to record such communications if they were pronounced orally. It is thanks to this trait of Chinese civilization that we have an exceptionally valuable corpus of primary sources, one which chronicles the religious motivations and ritual rationales articulated by supplicants and diviners down the centuries. Beside prayer texts, two other types of previously unexplored or underexploited primary sources form the documentary backbone of this book. The liturgical sermons that Lu Xiujing used to explain the import and technique of the new Lingba ritual to his practitioners, who were the first, to his disciples, who were the first practitioners of this new rite. And then narrative testimonies of the experienced effects of rituals, which were otherwise only known from prescriptive texts. These experiential narratives, as I call them, offer an important resource to the religious historian. The gradual multiplication of passive initiation opened a growing space for lay practice in medieval Taoism. A medieval guide, exceptional guide to this side of the Taoist quest for deliverance is Du Guangting's Divine Manifestations of Taoism, Daojiao Lingyanji, a late Tang collection of miracle tales that aim to make manifest the hidden effects of rituals, devotional practices, and sacramental objects. By laying bare the operative processes of deliverance, such narratives offer a rare insight into the religious imagination and experience of lay society. Placed side by side with liturgical prayers, predication texts, and doctrinal sources, experiential narratives bring a vivid immediacy to our grasp of medieval religious phenomena, offering a fresh view of Chinese society then and now. The questions Imperiled Destiny seeks to answer are these. What was the nature of the liabilities that weighed in the Taoist balance of fate? Which ritual and sacramental avenues were used to improve an unfavorable outcome? Who were the agents, as I've mentioned, of the redemptive process, and what were their respective roles? Beyond exploring the hopes and fears that animated Taoist religious practice, these lines of inquiry uncover a Taoist vision of humanity and its relationship to the supernatural. Could human agency intercede on behalf of sufferers in the seen and in the unseen world? The book details how an imperiled destiny was freed through ritual debt forgiveness. Deliverance came in various forms like healing, purification, release, or the emergence of the soul from darkness into light. Analyzing the Taoist doctrine of divine justice and the powerful effects of moral responsibility and involuntary exposure to evil on human destiny, causing loss, suffering, and death, the book points to the therapeutic efficacy of Taoist rituals for relieving anxiety and the apprehension of life-threatening perils. The promise of liberation and transcendence transformed the faithful's dread into exaltation. Lu Xiujing is a good example of that. The existential problems medieval Taoists confronted were timeless and universal. The book's focus on people and the remedies they devised highlights the fears and hopes not only of medieval society. Scholars have been at a loss to explain the apparent incongruity between Lu Xiujing's spirited defense of the institutions of Heavenly Master Taoism in Master Lu's summary order of the Taoist community, Lu Xiancheng Daomen Ke Lue, and his vigorous promotion, on the other hand, of Lingbao scriptures and rituals. How could the same person have held such divergent beliefs. Whatever the deeper springs of Lu Xiujing's motivation, the outcome of his reform was to amalgamate Taoism into an integrated native teaching that could hold its ground against the spread of Buddhism, while elevating the recent southern texts of Shangqing and Lingbao to preeminence. Lu's integrative endeavor erected a new edifice of Heavenly Master Heavenly Master foundations. Like many religious reforms, it presented its innovative character as a return to authentic origins. On another level, Lu Xiujing's transformation of medieval Taoism reflected the ongoing replacement of cult deities and associated sacrificial practices with the pure veneration of scriptures and ritual. Particular lineages and communities, including the divine incantations of the abyssal cavern set known from the Dongyuan Shenzhou Ji, continue to identify with the specific heritage of Zhang Daoling, but from the 5th century onward, Heavenly Master ritual in general, as exemplified by Master Redpine's Petition Almanac, became absorbed into a broad amalgam comprising Lingbao, Shangqing, and other elements. Taoism was on its way to becoming the hierarchically integrated liturgical organization that would be fully realized under imperial auspices under the reunited Tang. And I guess this is really the central point in terms of bringing something into the debate about Tianshidao, that you have this unique configuration in the medieval period, which really jumps a bit outside of the rails of what we're accustomed to studying in terms of Tianshidao, Lingbao, Shangqing, etc. In institutional Taoism, the Heavenly Master ritual known as petitioning, Zhou was the original procedure for presenting liturgical prayers. The main guideline for performing the ritual throughout the medieval period was a handbook that has come down to us under the title Master Redpine's Petition Almanac. Although the received version belongs to the Zhisong Zhangli, although the received version belongs to the late Tang or even 5 dynasties period, it is the product of an accretion of materials dating individually from the Eastern Han to the Tang. The handbook provided tools for calendrical divination, protocols for preparing and presenting petitions, and template prayers for every occasion. The introductory passage to the almanac establishes petitioning as the core of the saving dispensation of Heavenly Master Taoism. Scholars have questioned the reliability of this source on the grounds that it is anonymous, undated, and incorporates an assortment of Tianshi, Shangqing, and Lingbao materials. In my view, the fact that it continuously served performances of an evolving Tianshidao petition ritual down the centuries offers in itself an important historical insight. The breadth of its ritual agenda reflecting the reality of actual practice and the diversity of the medieval Tianshi belief system. Medieval China practiced a fusion of Heavenly Master and Lingbao rituals, while also assimilating the Mahayanist doctrine of universal salvation. For the practitioner and their families who were confronting the crises and anxieties of everyday life, the prospect of transcendence, that is escaping the human condition altogether, to roam free from all constraints of time, space, and suffering and death, was as remote as attaining the state of nirvana for Buddhists. Mahayana Taoists, as they call themselves, maintained that the individual pursuit of transcendence was paramount to negating universal salvation. It sprang from the illusory quest of the lesser vehicle. So to sum up, I would say that the contributions of imperiled destinies to Tianshidao studies, if any, are in the following areas. One, the assimilation of historical and mythical elements in the Heavenly Master Foundation narrative. This is something I haven't mentioned just now. In contrast, I would say with Terry's study, which admirably pins down the historical sources and evaluates them for what they are worth. I have focused more on the mythical side of the foundation narrative, which to me is not saying that I've been writing about anything less real, because any state, church, any organization, in fact, uses mythology in its foundation narrative alongside other things, and it's a crucial element in forming a collective identity. So I take this mental perception of a religion, of its own origins, very much to be part of the historical reality of that religion. Besides, if we decided that Tianshidao is not for real, it's not historical, what do? Do we throw it all out? Does the Tianshidao Church, as Vincent Gossart has shown, has existed now for 2,000 years, did it not exist? So I've placed the emphasis on this aspect, the mythical aspect, including the movement's a posteriori assimilation with regional traditions celebrating the culture heroes of Sichuan, which is a rather surprising element, that you would see a religious founder also in that light, in the company of the region's culture heroes. Secondly, the relationship between Tianshidao and Lingbao ritual, I've talked about that. The importance of hybrid sources like the Chisung Zhang Li for understanding the evolution of medieval Taoist beliefs and practice. And lastly, the historical reality of lived religion in a multifaceted and rapidly changing religious environment of medieval China, including, of course, especially the arrival and spread and popularity of Buddhism that Taoism during this period was very much confronted with. So I think I will stop there and hand over to Vincent Gossart. Thank you.
So Jonathan, do I?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay,
yes.
Good. Thank you so much. I'm really extremely happy and grateful to be here. I mean, the new Zoom culture in which we've been living for 2 years have brought the best and the worst. I'm sure we all have things to say about the worst, but Global Taoist Forum is certainly the best. So thank you, Jonathan, Elena, and Leo, and all the others. I'm also very excited to sit, even if virtually, together with Terry and Franciscus. I mean, I've been reading Terry's and Franciscus' work from the first days of my graduate studies, and now to discuss together our latest work is really a great honor. I add one more word of thanks to Steve and Laiji team to have made a welcoming home for my book manuscript in their wonderful book series on Taoism. I mean, to have now a high-profile, very well-edited and distributed book series on Taoist studies is also an important stage in the development of our field. I mean, globally, we have several homes, we have good journals, we have the forum, we have a book series. So I mean, these are all very encouraging signs for our field that we are maturing and getting some attention and respect in the larger field of humanities. Okay, so trying to talk about this book of mine on Heavenly Masters. I may want to start with saying a few words about how I got into writing this. This was not something that was planned from the start, but when earlier on working on late imperial Taoist history, such as, for instance, writing my book on the Taoist of Beijing, I kept running across stories of people going to Long Hushan for ordination or training, or meeting with the Heavenly Master, or Long Hushan officials, the so-called Fagwan, getting involved in the operations of the temples I was studying, or performing rituals, or, well, being important actors in the religious lives of late imperial China. So, and also reading the literature, novels, stories, anecdotes, and so on and so forth. the Zhang Heavenly Master and Long Hushan were all over the place. So they were obviously important. So I was looking for a reference work to tell me what was this institution that was mentioned over and over again. And there was no such synthesis. There were a few very specific articles here and there, but nothing that really explained why this place, Long Hushan, was so important and why so many people had to go there and to mention the person of the Heavenly Master. And also in the scholarly literature, up until I think very recently, I also felt there was a certain confusion between different categories, sometimes used one for the other. There is a lot of talk of Zhang Daoism as opposed to Tianshidao Daoism as the two main forms of Taoism, but then equating Zhang Daoism with sort of Heavenly Master Taoism seems to me a shorthand that needed some critical examination. There was also the use of the term Tianshidao, used both for describing the early church that Terry's book is all about, but also in certain works, including histories of Taoism written in Chinese, including by people from Long Hushan, covering all the way from Zhang Daoling to the present, right? So the idea, this more or less implicit idea that Tianshidao is basically, it's been there for 2000 years, it's been the same thing, it's the same Dao. And then there is also a very wide usage of the term lineage or pai, Chinese pai or fa pai or zong pai. And sometimes describe very specific actual lineages and sometimes refer to the continuation of the succession of the Zhang Heavenly Masters. Okay, so I wanted to sort of clear that confusion or at least try to make sense of it for myself. And so I started to try to pull together all the different documents and research on various aspects and various periods of the historical development of the Long Hushan and Zhang Heavenly Master institution, and that ended with the book that we are discussing today. And one more element was the fascination that I felt so many Chinese authors, both past and present, felt towards this institution that has been enduring for at least 1,000 years. That is at least 3 times as long as any Chinese dynasty ever lasted. And that's something that is very explicitly said in such terms in a number of sources in various periods. And I came to sort of share that fascination and try to objectify it and try to understand what made this institution so fascinating for so many people through early modern and modern history. Okay, so that was some of the reasons why I embarked on the project for writing this book. And then I ran across a number of difficulties, of course, which such a project entailed. One of them, obviously, is the sheer amount of sources. When you try to cover a very long history, then you come across all kinds of sources. And of course, with the nearer to the present you get in time, the more abundant and variegated are the sources. I mean, for the late imperial and 20th century, there are all kinds of documents, some of which we have edited with my friend Wang Jianchuan in a volume published in Taiwan, the Liaoji, that covers all the way from anecdotes and stories to diaries of literati and priests to newspaper articles and so on and so forth. But also, as I wanted to explore the question of the long-term continuity, I also had to go into medieval sources, which I usually don't work that much with. And so I sort of went out of my comfort zones and try to read and explore earlier sources. So that was a source of difficulty, right? The amount of sources, but at the same time, these sources are very scattered. And one frustration I've been feeling all through the process of researching and writing this book, and that I still feel, is that we don't have the archives of the Longhushan, and we will never have them. I mean, the Longhushan has been ransacked and pillaged and utterly destroyed several times, first by this Taiping, and then during the Beifa Northern Expedition period. And then, the Longhushan was the headquarters of a communist army during the Jiangxi Soviet, and several times since then, right? So we cannot do the kind of historical research on the Longhushan the way historians of the Roman Catholic Church do, with the help of the archives of the Vatican. And I think if we add even a portion of the archives that Longhushan, we know that Longhushan did accumulate. It was a huge bureaucratic machine, and it did produce an insane amount of paper, of a paper trail that was all burned down during the tragic moments in modern Chinese history. If we add even part of that archival sources, we would get a much more rounded and complex view of what kind of religious institution that was. And so we have, as part of my work, I've been trying to find traces and echoes of that kind of bureaucratic paperwork production in other documents like local gazetteers and government archives and other local archives and so on and so forth. And I think at some moments I could get a certain sense of how it worked simply from the echoes of other institutions that interacted with the Longhushan. We don't really get the voice of the Longhushan bureaucratic apparatus working on an ordinary basis, and that remains a frustration. And of course, because it tried to cover so much, the book certainly has many aspects in which it's only sort of looks at the surface of things, and especially in terms of rituals. I've been paying attention to the liturgical codification at Longhushan, and the way the institution tried to shape the ritual practices of Taoists, not only on Longhushan, but everywhere in the Chinese world through history. But that I felt that I've only barely touched the surface of this very complex issue, and much more needs to be done. And some of it is being done actually by scholars such as Xie Conghui in Taipei, who is doing very detailed, fieldwork-based evidential research on the ongoing codification of Taoist ritual and the role of central institution, especially the Heavenly Masters, in that process. Okay, now what the contribution of this book might be. I see maybe 4 aspects in which I've at least attempted to bring maybe a new perspective or a new vantage point on all problems. The first is the question of definitions. As I mentioned earlier, I still feel in certain scholarly works, even they are otherwise illuminating and brilliant, sometimes a certain confusion between terms. So I've been offering in that book clear definitions for terms, and of course they are just heuristic, they're just my definitions, and I'm extremely happy with other scholars using other definitions, but at least please try to define terms of that Tianshidao or Zheng or lineage when you use them. So that's sort of a message I try to send through this book. So the way I define terms is Tianshidao as the early church, is what Terry described in his book, and that opens the question of, is there still something we can call Tianshidao after the Tang, after the 10th century? I propose to leave that question open, but I only use the term to define the church as an integrated, coherent community as it worked in medieval and Tang China. Zheng, I use the term to give as a set of texts, an ordination rank, and the texts that are conferred through that particular ordination rank, and the rituals that people can do when they get that particular ordination rank. That's my definition, my use of Zheng, not a community, not a church, not whatever. It's a set of texts and rituals. And all of these two things, Tianshidao and Zheng, are defined not by relation to the Zhang Heavenly Master family and Longhushan as a place. So I use a different term, concept maybe, that's the Longhushan institution. And that's really an institution. It's a bureaucratic institution that manages people and resources, and that has authority and monopolistic rights over certain rituals and ordinations and other operations. And the institution is made up of a patriarchal line. It's not a lineage, as I define it. It's a line. It's one person birth generation that inherit a monopolistic power. So that's and that line is within the Zhang lineage. A holy site. So there is a whole chapter in the book about Longkushan as a holy site, one of the Dongtian Fui, as it were, as a very particular place in a specific religious environment and landscape in central Jiangxi province. Its temples and their staff, the so-called Fagwan, the Taoist officials working for that bureaucratic institution. And that all of that goes with myth building. As Franciscus was saying just now, the myths are even more important than the historical accounts, because that the myth about the history of Longkushan and the history of the Zhang family is really the foundational stones of this whole institution and the way it operates in early modern and modern China. So the myths about Zhang Daoling, the myths about successive heavenly master, and especially extremely charismatic and important ones, such as the 30th Zhang Xixian, right, the late Northern Song, and other mythical priests who are said to have been trained at Longkushan, especially Sasho Dian. And one of the things I found about the Longkushan is that it has a long history of their being absolutely fantastic storytellers. They are very good, and the way the stories they've been telling and retelling, and the way these stories have been accepted and adopted and reprinted by all kinds of people outside of Longkushan is a major reason why this institution was so successful and enduring throughout the whole second millennium. And then my fourth concept is lineages. I don't think the way I define lineage as a corporate organization managing material and spiritual resources, that does not exist before the Song, right? So to me, I mean, with the definition I work with, it doesn't make sense to talk about Zhengi lineages or Taoist lineages or heavenly master lineages before the Song. And one of the things the Zhang at Longkushan are very good at doing is building lineages and controlling various clerical lineages that all draw their authority from Longkushan. So there is not one Zhengi lineages, there are lots of different Zhengi lineages, but what they have in common is their reference to Longkushan. That's the source of authority. So that was sort of contribution number one, definitions. Very quickly, I see time is running. The longue durée approach. I know it's not very fashionable anymore in sinology to write a book about 2,000 years. I like doing that, and I continue doing that. Maybe it's an indulgence, but I think it's of course it's extremely important and useful to have very focused studies on specific person and historical moments. But I think it's also useful to have books that cover a very long period of time and that provide a framework to think about continuities and ruptures and what are the moments where things really change. And such long durée frameworks are of course not meant to be definitive books. I'm very sure and very happy for people to criticize all kinds of specific points I try to make in the book and bring new documents and refine the arguments or just turn it over its head maybe. But what I hope to accomplish this book is to provide a framework to think about these issues. Is what's the connections during different historical periods between these different things, right? The Longkushan institution as a bureaucratic institution, and the Zhengi set of texts and ritual, and the Zhang family, and the early Tianshidao church. And one reason for this choice of a very longue durée approaches, I think there is still a coherent vision of society. Lots of things change, most things change within the institution, but I think there is still a coherent vision of society that we can see at work in this long period. And I must say that I'm very grateful to the series editors, Steve and team, to have indulged me and accepted the very provocative subtitle I chose, the 2000 years of the Taoist state. I was almost certain that they would say, okay, we accept the book manuscript, but please, this subtitle is a joke. We are not going to print that. They never said a word about the subtitle, so that I think I've pulled through. I'm quite happy about this. Third point, the change of society. So I see a current vision of society at work at Longchamp over the long term, but it's also a very important moment. Longchamp really emerges as a center for reorganizing Taoism and the Taoist church, the Taoist clergy, as part of the Chinese state and society in that particular moment of the 10th century, in that particular place, which is the Nantong dynasty. And I think the Nantong contribution to building modern Chinese culture is still widely overlooked. And I don't see the history of the Longchamp institution as something, I don't see it in a theological way, right? It didn't have to work like this. There was something very contingent about this history. And the contingence is the way, whereas most of the Chinese world was in chaos during the 10th century, the Nantong was mostly at peace, prosperous, and very ready to accept new development by new type of cultural and religious leaders. And the Zhang Heavenly Masters were certainly the most successful of those newly emerged cultural and religious leaders for a new Chinese society that was emerging on the ashes of the medieval world of the time that basically burned down, that was already in very poor shape by the 9th century and that finished burning down during the 10th century. So that really, I see that as really a moment of very rapid and deep cultural change. And the Longchamp institution is one of the institutions that really took advantage of that radical social change to build its own success story. Fourth, and I really end up with that, I think in the book, and I need, and other scholars need to take that argument further, but I try to show in the book, especially when talking about the 43rd Heavenly Master, Zhang Yuchu, who lived in the early Ming, I started to realize to what extent our vision of Taoist history, which is largely dependent on the Taoism, is a vision that has gone through the very heavy editing hands of Zhang Yuchu as the Heavenly Master and the other elite Taoists who were working with him and around him and after his death. But when scholars are trying to look at texts in the Taoist canon that also have other editions from the Mongol Yuan and Ming period, and realizing that quite often this comparison shows us that the texts in the Taoism have been quite heavily edited. And what we see as just, we tend to see, of course, we're usually not so naive, but we still tend to see the Taoism as just the repository of the Taoist text. Actually is Taoist text as chosen, selected, and edited with a very particular vision in mind. And that vision is that of the Zhang Heavenly Master institution, which was then at the apex of its power and had a very explicit and clear agenda of reshaping the whole of Taoist tradition and placing it at the heart of the Ming Empire. And I think we need to be aware of that and to understand what the vision of the institution was, to understand the way they produced the text, the way they did, the text that we are reading all the time when pursuing Taoist history. Okay, maybe I'll stop here. I'll add a few more things to say about the next steps, but maybe we can keep that for the question and answers moment of that discussion. So thank you again.
好，谢谢3位，3个都很精彩的报告。可能100多个人，很多人没用过那个 Zoom， 所以有2个，一个是很多人都没有名字，比如 iPhone、iPad， 你看你那个 Window 上面有一个3点，可以按那个 Rename， 选另外一个名字。第二个，你有问题的话，有2个方法的，一个是那个 Chat， 你可以直接打，还是另一个是 Reactions， 那下面可能是最右边有一个 Reactions， 就是一个 Raise Hand， 一个手就可以举手的。好 ，Daniel 已经举手的，so I just say in English too. So if you want to rename, there's 3 little dots at the top of your window that you can rename yourself. So some people are still named iPhone and iPad. I know that's not your real name. It's and at the bottom there's a raise reactions and a raise hand. So you can raise hand, and that will kind of bring you up to the queue. And I can Leo, or I can call you. Daniel.
Okay, so thank you all for your presentations and more broadly the work you've been doing, driving the field forward for decades at this point. It's obviously invaluable. This question was just for Gosar, since you brought up Professor Gosar, I'm sorry. Since you brought up the issue of your provocative subtitle, I am provoked, but not by the 2000 as much as the state. So I mean, I've asked you before, and now in this public forum, please answer, what is your definition of the state? You know, we have this Weberian definition of monopoly on legitimate violence. Is the violence all supernatural? And these people wield spirit soldiers and do exorcisms and discipline, you know, what Terry calls miscreants in the spiritual realm. In the Yuan dynasty, you have a fascinating portion on militias defending Longhushan. Yeah, what's your, how do you define this as a state when we know that the Chinese state is jealous of its prerogatives, but also able to collaborate on the local level and kind of devolve power?
I was more or less expecting this. Thanks, Daniel. Jonathan, how should we do? Do you like to take several questions, or do I answer this now? Or?
Yeah, go ahead. We'll just take one question and answer right away.
Okay, and please stop me after a few minutes, because
yeah, we'll do.
Obviously
I will.
Yes. Yeah. I certainly hope there is no scholar of political science in this virtual room, and I will try to avoid stepping into such a room filled with that kind of scholars and I mean, upholding that language of the Taoist state. I was discussing this with Christian Lamoureux recently, and he told me he's not even sure there is such a thing as Chinese state before the 20th century. So I don't have a very good definition of a state. What I meant is that the institution, the Longhushan institution, did a number of things that we tend to associate with states, right? So you mentioned the violence, of course, and there is the whole idea of, and that's ritual violence against non-humans, as it were. But I think for the historical Chinese, that's just as real as violence on the battlefield or against bandits, right? So that's one aspect, but also tax. The whole idea of taxing and registering people, that's extremely important. And that's something that the imperial state was very uncomfortable with when they saw the Taoist institutions registering people's name and collecting taxes from them. And these taxes were also essentially spirit money, right? But again, I mean, to historical Chinese, Westerners have been, laughing at Chinese spirit money as mock money or whatever for the whole contemporary period. But I think for historical Chinese, I mean, spirit money is a very real currency, right? It has a very real effect, and it it operates very real transactions. And the way local community is collected, and that's still done in certain parts of the country, not everywhere, of course, but in some parts of Jiangnan, it's still actually done. Right? Each year, each household pays a certain amount of spirit money to the local temples, and local temples send it to the Chenhuang Miao, and the Chenhuang Miao send it to the central Taoist temple, which used to be controlled by people appointed by Long Hussain, right? So this idea of registering people names so that people are covered, I mean, in exchange for their taxes and registration, they get protection, right? And so they can appeal to the Heavenly Master, to the central Taoist administration for protection against demons, and then they can file lawsuits and so on and so forth. And that's a very state-like way of implementing a certain order on society. And that's what I meant by the Taoist state. And of course, the whole project, the Long Hussain institution, is not a separate state from the imperial state. It's being part or at the core of the imperial state, right? And doing all the things that the imperial state also did. And even though the Heavenly Master was a state official for 1 millennium, non-stop, the imperial state was very uncomfortable with that kind of behavior. But that went on and on until the 20th century. Okay, so maybe a better subtitle would have been 2,000 years of state-like behaviors, but I think that's less fun.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful because it also differentiates them from the Kongs of Tufu, which is in some ways almost the more relevant parallel.
Right. I'm sure the Kongs were jealous of the Heavenly Master's powers of taxation.
Anna, please. Anna, can you unmute? Oh, there.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry, I was unmuted. I was muted. So thank you for 3 wonderful presentations, and of course for the work you all do in the Taoist studies field that has advanced the field enormously. So from the presentations today, it's more of a consideration than a question, but each one of you very differently mentioned or brought up the question of sources. Terry was talking about how many sources are still to be explored in the period that he's working on, and then Franciscus was talking about using hybrid sources to sort of expand the understanding not only of the history but also of the mythology of the Tianshidao, and then Vincent, of course, using also later sources, but also bringing up the very question, a very really important question of what are the sources that we have and why do we have them, and how were they selected and with what intent were they selected for us to read and consider and understand. So I was just wanting to hear a bit more about possibly your plan for expanding the source. Of course, all of you said this is an expanding field, so we don't have the final word on this, and so I wonder how you're approaching future expansion in your sources and what you envision seeing in those sources. I know this is a general question, but I love how this is sort of a work in progress, and expanding on the sources will probably give us all a different perspective. Thank you.
Great question. I'd like to jump in there first. Terry or Franciscus?
Well, yes, if I may say something to this, I find interesting to try and expand the use of sources a bit out of the field, out of the Taoist canon, to look into different. Vincent Gossart has done this very much by looking at newspapers and trying to find archival material and so forth. A lot of the work that I have found the most interesting in Taoist studies is on the border between using scriptural sources and literature, secular literature, fiction. The links between Taoism and the theater are very clear. Theater as a ritual art, originally. The origin of so-called fiction that is self-consciously created imaginative literature is clearly also in the Zhiguai and so forth tradition of religious literature. So I think these kind of borderline fields are very interesting to explore. They're also quite difficult because we know that secular writers had their own take on Taoism, and even like the writers of stele inscriptions that were literati had their own very particular views, which are so what they write there is not necessarily something of immediate historical value in understanding Taoism, but it is very much of value in understanding the place of Taoism in Chinese society, how it is regarded by the people. So I think in terms of, in this last book, for me, this was quite a discovery. I've been working on prayer texts for some time. I've gone further into that. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of prayers that survive from the medieval period. There again, there's a problem of interpretation, because we know that although they speak of specific people, the names are, of course, erased because all the particulars have to be erased from these potent documents to kind of sanitize them after they have been used. But they are sort of templates, there are exemplary prayers that on each different case that can be reused and adapted. So they are historical. We do see that they correspond to some event, but they were also reused and adapted. So the liturgical sermons, this was a particular case of Lu Xiaojing, who for the first time introduced a brand new ritual and had trouble getting the idea across to his public, and therefore inserted sermons into the liturgy itself as a part of the liturgy. This is also novel. I don't believe anybody has looked at these yet. And maybe there are more liturgical sermons and other traditions as well that could throw a very interesting light on the whole liturgical tradition. And then, of course, I've always worked on these experiential narratives, which also border on the Chuanxi tradition of the Tang and the sort of early proto-fictional imaginative stories that then became very popular in Tang and Song times. So first, for my taste, the new territory lies in these kind of borderline sources that belong to different sections of Chinese culture and society.
Maybe if I can jump in and build on Eleanor's question on methodology, right? And not only sources, but Terry, you mentioned the Taiwan Fa Shi, right, as kind of the imputing like the present on the past. Or Franciscus, you talked about the ritual agendas. How do you say it in Chinese? The 仪式议程 or something, right? Is kind of reflective of the community, right? And Vincent, you had the echoes and traces, right? And kind of for all three of these, it seems that it's those sources, right, that you're using are somewhat incomplete to get to the community. So my question is, what methodologies maybe outside even Taoist studies, think of anthropology or sociology or religious studies, kind of like, how did you approach those lacuna in the text, right? Even if I know this text is there, or, but it's kind of, maybe from the perspective of a priest or a Taoist writer. So what was useful to your approach, and then kind of even thinking about that for Taoist studies, right? If how might these three books speak to other people inside those fields, right? Religious studies. What might this methodology that the three of you have, your approach to Tianshidao, like, how can that be of influence and importance to other traditions in China and elsewhere?
Okay, so that makes the question very broad and hard to deal with. We go back to the more narrow original question. One of the things I think is very important actually for going forward is our tomb documents, especially Mu Zhiming. And I see in the audience Professor Asandri, who has worked on this. And I've done a little preliminary work trying to look at biographies of Taoists in Mu Zhiming. And I think that's a very useful type of evidence, that probably we can follow all through Chinese history. I mean, the collections now are mostly for the early documents, but I suspect we have these things from the entire gamut of Chinese history, which would be very useful, I think. I want to sort of reinforce Franciscus's ideas about fiction or creative writing maybe in China and its relationship to Taoism. And I have to point out the Wenchang Hua Shu, my very first object of study, is a proto-novel and really is very important in the history of Chinese novel writing. It's never mentioned. And I think that's true for a number of Song Taoist sources, actually. Maybe Vincent has something to say?
Yeah, I'll be chiming in. I think basically the same thing. We've been mentioning myth making before, and it's really a key part of the story, especially in a religion like Taoism, where the historical existence of the so-called founders is so often extremely moot. I mean, we are not going to slide into a discussion of was Zhang Daoling an historical person, but that's I think at the very least very open to doubt. But one of the fascinating thing about the 2000 years of this history of Zhang Daoling and then the Tianshidao and then the Longhoshan institution is how they created very powerful and convincing stories to lay out their vision of society, their vision of salvation, their vision of the good life, and the way they intend to implement that through ritual, through various things. And the way this was very powerfully disseminated throughout society by various media, including, as we have said, novels and theater and ballads and stories and all kinds of performing arts. And that's a core, I think, of all the stories we've been telling, the three of us and other scholars, people such as Mark Mullenbelt and others. And maybe, I'm not sure scholars of religion outside of China would see that as something entirely new or extremely surprising. But certainly when we compare to historians of other traditions that have more archival documents, a larger traditional source base, and who are really intent on really telling the factual history of the tradition, and maybe will pay less attention to myth making. I mean, maybe the contribution of Taoist studies is to remind them that myth making is really a very, very important part of what any religion is about, and especially Taoism is. One more word about sources. We all know that, but I think it bears repeating. There's an awful lot of manuscript, especially ritual manuscript around, and John just mentioned in the chat that, of course, the living ritual tradition is a key source, and the manuscript, which is the basis on which the rituals are performed. Some of these manuscripts have been collected, some even reprinted, but there is so much more to be found when China opens again and we can resume fieldwork. But of course, our colleagues in China are doing this. And these manuscripts are extremely important, and not only for ritual in the strict sense. In the liturgical manuals, you find lots of stories. You find description of the gods, who they are, where they come from. You find personal accounts of Taoist priests, including lots of manuscripts have stories about, they are going to Longhoshan and telling about their experience and so on and so forth. And these manuscripts are a key part. And these manuscripts also give us an insider view. The published texts, including the Dao Zong, are messaged, sanitized, not entirely. They have a lot to say. They still have a lot more to say. But when we look at the published text and we look at the manuscript, we have different views. Like for the outsiders to why, and then for insiders to DNA. And these are different perspectives on what Taoism is all about.
Maybe I can insert a question here, if you don't mind, because I have a question for Vincent that I think is quite relevant. and it has to do with spirit writing. So in our Taiwan reading group, we're reading the materials related to Xu Zhenjun and that cult. And there's an incident in the beginning of the Yuan where they appeal for a title from Zhang Tianshi, but it's unclear to me, at least. It's unclear to me whether they are dealing with the historical Zhang Tianshi in Longhushan, or they're dealing with Zhang Daoling as a disincorporated spirit being communicated with through spirit writing, through a local spirit writing medium. And I'm wondering if that sort of confusion is common, and if so, how you deal with it.
Yeah, extremely common and very tricky. But in the case of the Xu brothers cult in Fuzhou, I think it's pretty clear that in the end they got their canonization through the actual living Heavenly Master at Longhushan. You're muted.
Unmute yourself, Terry. Terry, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, that may be, but that document, if it ever existed, is not preserved. And I don't understand why you go to all the trouble of getting a document like that and you don't record it in the very voluminous amount of records that survive from the Xu cult.
Yeah, that's a good point. But there were so many other similar cults who were actually getting their ordination document for Longhushan at the same time. There's no reason why the Xu brothers would not have done that as well.
Supposedly they are the first, because it's just after the installation of this new Tianshi. But anyhow.
John, did you want to chime in? I know you feel free to unmute yourself and chime in with your comment if you wanted to. There's so many people. I'm not sure that you.
What I had to say, I said.
Okay. All right, others, you can just unmute yourself directly and ask, or you can raise a hand and so many questions. It's like coursing through all our brains. So.
If there are no other questions, I might come back an instant to the question about sources and other disciplines. We didn't speak about the other disciplines. I think for me, it's clear that in my case, it's the social history of religion is a very important aspect in the way I approach it. In fact, as a historian, my interest in religion is primarily as a really privileged window into the social history of a period, and what the French call the history of mentalities. I know that this is a controversial term, but the conceptual world of a given period and a given cultural context is nowhere more clear than through religious sources. So social history, cultural history, and of course anthropology, the kind of narrative literature that I've been talking about, is to my mind one of the primary sources for historical anthropology for an earlier period where you have no more field to go out to observe living traditions. There, the second best thing you can do is read these stories. It's what Glenn Dudbridge called the experience of the religious experience of lay society that speaks through these stories, and it's a very, very important source. We've talked about novels, imaginative narrative literature, but of course, and the theater, but nobody has mentioned poetry. I see here Stephen Bokenkamp. I think you'll agree with me that poetry is really a prime source for understanding the history of Taoism. And then I completely agree with what Terry Kleeman said about the Mujaming. They've been used recently in very creative ways to get at the lives, the biographies of either marginal people or people who are overlooked by canonical or historical tradition, especially monks and women, and crossing these two nuns. You find very extremely interesting stories about their lives through Muzhiming. So this is extremely important. Of course, in all fields of Chinese studies, they are being more and more discovered, but I think that's particularly true for Taoism as well.
Great. Gil has his hand raised, and this makes me remember that I should pause it. Elena and Gil are both on the steering committee for the forum, and Liu Jingyu, special thanks to her for running the room today. And just a reminder after today that there'll be future forums, and if you have ideas for forums, to please get in contact with the steering committee, and we'll be happy to talk with you. All right, Gil, please.
Yeah. So Franciscus, well, first I want to thank Hussain, Terry, and Franciscus for wonderful books and wonderful past books and future books. Really fantastic work. Franciscus just mentioned, Terry's mentioned earlier of the Muzhiming. I just want to say that besides Muzhiming, there are various other stones in China that preserve a lot of material. So I just want to plug into the project I've been and Richard will be working on with Chinese scholars and trying to get more and more of this kind of stone material, both Muzhiming, but also temple inscriptions and so on. And one of the things that really caught my both reading, but also when Hussain mentioned it again, how the Daozang sort of in some way kind of shapes the way we read the texts. Stone inscriptions are kind of locked, they can't really be edited. I mean, they can be edited when they're reprinted into the Daozang or somewhere else, but the actual stone itself, unless they're destroyed or recarved, they kind of preserve earlier material. Sometimes I kind of run not necessarily contrary, but in kind of distinction to the way they're described in some of the more canonic formulations of narratives, of establishment of temples and lineages and so on. So I think there's much more work that can be done with very sensitive readings of inscriptions and so on, and very often trying to read them against the grain, so not that use them as proofs for the texts, but kind of the opposite of saying, well, these discrepancies are not because the texts are correct and there's something wrong with the stele, but probably the other way around, which is something we tend to be very sort of not quite logographic, but very maybe paper-centric. So trying to find sort of how to read against the grain with the written manuscript, with the written steles and inscriptions, but also try to make much better use. And I think most of us don't really have the training for that, of how to use non-written material sources, sort of all the various cave shrines and temples and statues, all that stuff that's out there. Very few of us are trained archaeologists and don't quite know how to use that material in useful ways. And I think that's maybe something that we want to think about, of how to actually learn to use that material in better ways, such as the way that Greco-Roman historians use archaeology to do Greco-Roman religion. I don't think we have the training to do that, but I'm trying to sort of think how we can train people to do that kind of work. It's not really a question, but hopefully someone answers that.
All right. Jonathan says that he finish with your thoughts. Finish your thoughts. Okay, Jonathan. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, if nobody, I would like to venture a question. Beverly here from Arizona State University. Thank you for all your thought-provoking presentation. My question concerns Professor Franciscus Verilin. If I'm not mistaken, you mentioned interiorization and used abdomen to explain a form of it. This reminds me of the personification of the macrocosmic Tao in humans in the 6th century Taoist text, 太上妙法本相经. This is my primary text for dissertation. Authors of this scripture use the concept of Dao Xing to define and expand the connection. So my question is, two questions. I wonder if you would associate personification of the anthropomorphic Tao as interiorization of it. And second question is, would you please elaborate on the interiorization, if you did mention the interesting term, interiorize? you mentioned something interior and then you used abdomen to explain it, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for the question. Yes, I did mention interiorization, and I made a contrast between the Lingbao ritual as defended by Lu Xiujing and the earlier Tianshidao sacrificial tradition, where offerings were made in the setting of a court audience, a ritual setting of a court audience. Lu Xiujing says this is not what it's about. It's where your destiny is played out is actually within yourself, hence the abdomen, and it's also an allusion, of course, to alchemy and to physiology. So the whole preoccupation with the self, what defines the self in the 5th century, is very much to do with the definition of the person and what individuates a given person. Because for Lu Xiujing, like for other Taoists of the time, an individual was an aggregate of different souls and spirits, of material and spiritual and so forth, which correspond to the whole yin-yang and 5 phases cosmology and so on. So these things are endowments, every individual gets, but there's also factors which individuate and makes one different from the other. And this is what creates personality and self. And I think that the Lu Xiujing's interior gaze, I mean, you have that, of course, in all religions, that sacrifice is redefined at some point by saying what is expected of you is not really to take the life of a living being or to make an offering of a precious object and so forth. What is expected of you is the offering of yourself, really, so which you express through self-abnegation, through renunciation, through religious vows, through the celibacy, all kinds of things, fasting, you know. So it is really more to do with your interior self than with this external action. This is something every religion goes through at some point, the sublimation of the concept of sacrifice, which places it within. And this is what you see very clearly in Lu Xiujing. The personification of abstract principles, I'm not sure about that, but there's certainly the idea, and that is connected with meditation, which is also becomes very important, again, thanks perhaps in part through Buddhist influence, but also connecting back to the Zhuangzi and Laozi traditions, which claim that you can, through meditation, through your interior vision, incorporate the universe. The famous phrase in the Laozi, you don't need to look out your window to discover the universe. You can do this in the seclusion of your oratory. And so I would say interiorization means incorporation of the outer world as well, interestingly enough. It's not just turning your sacrificial action within, but it's also taking in the world instead of going out towards it. That's how I see it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Since Jonathan has to go, I am his backup for the moderating job here. We have a question from actually Frederic. Would you kindly unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you very much. My questions have become 2 by now. I hope they're short questions. So thanks, first of all, for these very, very, very interesting talks. And some of the books I've read and looked in, not all of them yet. I'm looking forward to do that. I have a very kind of random question that came up with the last question to Professor Varel. First of all, have you stumbled in these texts that you were working with in the subject on wisdom as a condition for redemption? Because I work with early Tang Dynasty texts, and that does come up sometimes. And I've found that in stone inscriptions too, and I've wondered if that appears anywhere else.
Yes, definitely in the 4th, 5th century, a factor in redemption is discernment.
Discernment, okay.
Discernment, and that is connected to the whole prajna wisdom philosophy that is also spreads very quickly and with great popularity in China at that time, and appeals also to Taoists. But it's to people like Lu Xiujing, the importance of discernment or wisdom for redemption is your ability to tell good from evil. This is what really discernment is all about, and it is also connected with a kind of a hierarchical thinking that Lu Xiujing was an aristocrat, and he was very conscious of hierarchical distinctions. But this is not just a kind of a social snobbery or anything like that. It's really a matter of keeping intellectual categories distinct and clearly making the difference between things that are not commensurate. And of course, the ultimate thing that you must distinguish between is good and evil. And so the whole idea, the whole preoccupation that the writers of this period had with falsification, with fake scriptures, with so forth, was connected to that. What is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is false. And of course, for priests and scholars like these people, Tao Hongjing and Lu Xiujing, the issue there was salvation of their flock. You know, it was important whether they were spreading false messages or right messages, because everything depended on that. But for every individual, I think the issue of discernment was linked to wisdom, and in that way, definitely to redemption.
Great.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you very much. May I throw in my second question, or am I?
Of course. Go right ahead.
Also very quick, since these are three specialists on such a large stretch of time, actually. I've worked usually in the middle age period somehow. How about you've been, I mean, like what I've heard from these talks now, there is the Taoist masters who construct the Taoism and so on. To what extent do you think, or would you say there is competition between different Taoist masters from obviously the entitled textual traditions? Yeah, and all these things. Is that a clear question, or should I try to make that more professionally clear?
Yeah, I think that's for all three of you. All three of you.
And I would say that every new Tao Pai is a new attempt at getting a new audience and increasing your revenue in a very cynical sort of way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Among other religious goals as well, of course.
If I may, I think, of course, there would always be a lot of competition, both for business, ritual business, resources, and prestige and positions. But I think institutions in general, and certainly the Heavenly Master institution at Long Hushan, worked very much to limit competition. It worked as a licensing agency, so providing licenses to certain people and not other, to certain gods and not other, and trying to regulate all of this in a way that there would be a position and a niche for pretty much everyone, and that competition did not become ungainly and damaging for the religion in general and for the well-being of the communities. So there was quite a lot of regulation of competition by prestigious institutions such as the Along Hushan and some others as well, and the central temples, which were sort of branches of the Long Hushan, also did the same thing locally, trying to promulgate clear rules about who could do what rituals in what places for which audience at what price and so on and so forth. So yeah, competition and at continuous attempts at limiting competition.
Franciscus, do you have any thoughts to offer on that question?
Could I just add one thing? One thing that I think will be very instructive in this regard, the scholars in Taiwan are putting together a history of Taiwan Taoism. And there's enough material there that I think you're going to really be able to see each Taoist priest, each Taoist family, how they evolve over time, what their base of operations is and how it interacts with neighboring Taoists and things like that. So I think that's going to eventually be a very useful resource for addressing these sort of questions.
I'm going to use my privilege as the step-in moderator. One can also, we don't have Wang Jianchuan online for this session, but he's written very extensively on the more recent sort of late imperial to early Republican period. Within the Tianshifu, within the Longhushan lineage, there were different sort of splinter, groups, competitions among them as well. But going back even to the Tang Song early medieval period, the early sort of a late imperial, one can think about these different sort of mountainsides, the Gezhao Shan and all these other different sort of centers that were attempting for the kind of competition that Frederick was actually thinking perhaps about as well. We have, we were actually set to go until 1:30, but thanks to Liu Jinyu and her sort of a generosity, we might be able to go further. So please, gather your thoughts and maybe ask questions to, seize the time. And 而且呢，我们有中国的这个从亚洲方面的中国、日本还有台湾这个方面来的这个有问题的话，也请大家呢随时随意的尽早的抓紧时间提问啊，我们还有一些时间。Steve, you want to?
Were you talking to me? Yeah.
Oh, yes. You.
Thank you. Since I have these three wonderful presentations in front of me and the three wonderful presenters all talking about the same subject, first of all, let me thank you all. But also, a question that I've and there was a partial answer in Vincent's book. So if you would like to repeat your answer, that's fine. But I'm interested in the change that took place over the history of Taoism, to use Vincent's terms, I guess, from Tianshidao to the Zhengyi text in the petitioning ritual. It seems like in the text that Terry studied, every Taoist family had to have their own oratory where they would send up petitions, but then it became, in kind of a Catholic fashion, the role of the priest rather than of the individual practitioner. So I was wondering if you could say something about that change in ritual practice, which since the petitioning ritual is indeed a through line in Celestial Master practice. Thank you very much.
I think in that particular tradition of the petition ritual, the scribal role of the priest explains probably their importance. It's of course also their ordination rank and the authority that they have in the other world, which gives weight to the message being transmitted. It's certainly that. But I think the scribal role is absolutely crucial. These had to be first-class documents. They were modeled on court documents, for which, as we know, the finest writers in the empire were recruited to produce texts that would stand the test of time. And this was true also to a large extent for these petition texts. So the lay commoner would not have been able to produce these kind of documents. I think that's probably, I don't know when this starts, whether this is true. Terry can maybe tell us for the very early community to some extent, or whether it was really a personal thing. I don't know whether there were written texts right from the start, or whether the texts that we have from the very early period are rather transcripts of things which were orally presented, transcripts for the purpose of archiving them. this is not very clear. The Chisung Zhejiangli has, of course, long sections on the production of petitions and on their disposal in the end. But I think the clerical role is very much to do with the scribal qualifications of the priest there.
Thank you very much. That's the answer I more or less expected from your book, and I think there's a lot to be said for that. It is an interesting change, though, in that the religion seems to be more placed in the hands of specialists. This communication, and since you mentioned the individual and the kind of the importance of the individual in Liu Shoujing's practice, it's quite true. But he also was one of the ones who seemed to emphasize the role of the Fashi in acting as mediator and sending up these communications with the celestial bureaucracy. So it seems to me to be an interesting change that maybe we should spend some time looking at some more. I don't know. Do you have anything to say, Terry?
Gee, I would point out that millions of Taoists across the face of China are able to write petitions, and most of them are not terribly well educated, but they learn a specific genre of language. And that doesn't mean that they have high literacy overall. It means that they have specific competencies. And we should point out that literacy in traditional China was literacy in literary Chinese. Vernacular Chinese was never written down, and it's much more difficult to write than simple classical. Just from my language teaching days.
Yeah, from same question from maybe a slightly different perspective. I think the question Steve raised is this, what I see as really one of the largest questions in our field now. That's the Taoism transition and transformation. Because basically what we see in the song, we can really trace to the present. And I think the Tang world is a distinctly different cultural and religious world. And the whole Tang song change and the way it affected religious practice and religious organization is something that is just barely starting to be researched, and we need something very comprehensive, looking at all the records we have. And of course, we have much more records for the song, but still, we have lots of documents, and we mentioned like Mujaming and or inscriptions and other evidence and narrative evidence from the Tang, which still await for a systematic examination in terms of what do these sources say about the way rituals were practiced in Tang society, and how did that change into the song. As far as the Zhang Tianshi line and Long Hushan is concerned, and its role in this change, in the first stage of its historical development, basically 9th century to the late 1000s song, the Long Hushan did not, as far as we know, produce liturgical codification. Maybe they did, but it's not really apparent in the sources. So they did not change like the petition ritual. That's not what they did in the first stage. And then later they certainly did that. By the Southern song, we start to have authoritative and very innovative liturgical codification produced at Long Hushan and disseminated. Zhang Xiuyu, that's the first. And that's really 12, 14s, 40s, 50s, right? And that's already a bit late in the history of the institution. The first thing Long Hushan did was the question of licensing. Who was allowed, who was given a title, who was ordained, who was given a license to perform these petition rituals and other rituals? Not what they did exactly, but who was legitimate to do these rituals. And certainly they examined people, and they looked at their capabilities and competences, like Terry did. Were they able to write proper petitions or not? So they certainly checked and license before they started to codify and train.
Thank you. As they say, all good things will come to an end. And I would like to, on behalf of our steerage committee, maybe we could entertain one more question. Jingyu, thank you for being so tolerant with the time, with the extension. So we have actually in the chat section, a question coming from, could you verbalize this? Just, Jared, could you ask this question yourself, or do you want me to read it? Right. Okay, here really it's coming, this is really coming the question. All right. Why was Long Hushan chosen by the Heavenly Master? This is a question, I guess, addressed to all three. Well, let's see. Well, there were more questions. Okay, then please read. I will read it for the audience. Probably you can all see it, actually. Let me adjust this a little bit. So the question is, why was Long Hushan chosen by the Heavenly Master as the capital of the Taoist Church, and how important on religious map of China the site was before that?
Okay, maybe I can try to give a 2-sentence answer. That was one of the most peaceful and economically prosperous place during that sea change of the 10th century of the whole Chinese world. And there was a very strong military garrison there, and the Zhang family apparently were the religious advisors or chaplains or whatever you can call it to those very powerful military men. And they attracted lots of people and offering ordination. Elsewhere, the major temples that were offering ordinations were being destroyed, burned down, closed. And here we had a place which it was safe to travel to, that was prosperous, and that offered ordination to all, well, very widely. So that's why that's my short answer. And chapter 2 of my book is a long answer, but my short answer is that.
Go there and read it. All right.
And it was not really important before. It really emerged as a holy site in the Nantou.
All right, then.
Yeah, I would also say that it isn't the Zhang Tianshi that chose Long Hushan. It's the Zhang family who was in Long Hushan who became Tianshi. You know, they were probably just one of many branches of the Zhang family.
Oh yeah, there were Zhangs all over the place with all of they're all having their own Zhang Tianshi temple, Tianshi Tang or Tianshi Miao. But this one at Long Hushan, they were really extra smart. and they were extra smart and had wonderful local conditions to develop their project.
But it's so hot.
All right, we really have to now conclude, and I want to, on behalf of our steerage committee, thank our three wonderful presenters, Terry, Vincent, and also Franciscus, and thank you all for your wonderful presentation, and also for the audience for engaging with their presentation. And we have, more events coming, and please go to our site and register if you want to receive regular communications. And I want to turn over to my colleague, Eleanor. Do you have anything to offer before we conclude? Before we leave, we really will need to thank Liu Jingyu for actually doing all the the backstage work and making this possible. Eleanor.
Sorry, I didn't mean to raise my hand. I meant to applaud. So I don't have one final question. But really, thanks very much to all the presenters, and we hope to see you soon at our other events, which, as Liu said, will be on our website. So check out our website. I think I am putting it in the chat right now. So if you haven't gotten there before, please go and check it out. And if you have suggestions as well for us to feature other books, other ideas, other projects, reach out to us and we will try and organize something. So thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you. Well, take it home, I guess, Jingyu. So thank everyone. It's great to see so many familiar faces, and maybe the pandemic will lift. And we have good news reporting this morning, at least on the East Coast, and we don't know what's going on in the rest of the world, I guess. So thank you all. So really.